on Doge. Do you think it's enough to kind of turn around what's going on?
No country in the history of the world has ever done this. We tend to overcomplicate this a little bit, and I'll try to use just a few numbers.
Chipping away at his goal of $1 trillion in government spending cuts.
We're saving about $4 million per day.
There's been Tom Homan and Trump administration have been deporting.
The nexus, of course, with Venezuela is Caracas was the most violent city in the world not that long ago. What did they do? They emptied their prisons.
Let's just unpack a couple of things. Talk about Soros and funding BLM.
That was the first time you saw out-of-state groups funded by this network basically bring people in to fill up a camera. All of a sudden, bricks were showing up at protests, right, for people to throw through windows later in the day. Where did the bricks come from?
Parachuted into folks.
Yes, absolutely. So
By who?
There are a number of organizations.
Issue of activist judges.
Activist liberal judges act as almost sort of a super legislator. And then there was an idea floated of the Disinformation Governance Board here in the United States of America, a board of people who were going to decide what the truth was. This had been sort of a conspiracy theory, as many of these things at the time were, that ended up being true. What was at the bottom of a lot of this distrust that had developed?
Before you hear from Senator Eric Schmitt, I ask if you want to support this show. Remember, all you have to do is press subscribe and head over to winstonmarshall.co.uk for exclusive videos, content, and interviews. But without further ado, Senator Eric Schmitt. Senator Eric Schmitt, a great pleasure. Thank you so much for taking time to speak with me on your unbelievably busy schedule here in DC.
Well, it's great to be with you, and I'm a fan, not of what you're doing now, but I'm a Mumford guy. Like I was at a concert in St. Louis, maybe one of the best concerts. This has got to be maybe 10 years ago now. Traveled to Louisville to see Mumford & Sons back in like...
At the Yum Center.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, like maybe it was like 2019. And then a hidden gem on the new Basement tapes, is that what it was called?
Yes.
Was going back to Kansas City, which of course has a Missouri tie to it. So anyway.
It's a brilliant song. That's by the singer of the band. Yeah.
Big fan of the... big fan of the music, honestly.
Well, we were a big fan of Missouri and played in St. Louis many times.
Yep. Oh, yeah.
You didn't have to travel as far as Kentucky to see us.
Well, I was like a roadie, I guess, at that point. I was just following you guys along for a while.
You buttered me up so nicely there.
No, but true. I mean, you can
around.
I spent a lot of time on the road, and there's a few bands that would populate a lot of the music that I would listen to as I was traveling around Missouri. Mumford & Sons was like always a big one for me. Dave Matthews Band, and then I have eclectic music taste, but anyways, just a big fan. You guys were like real musicians, so I loved it.
Oh, thank you. So you've come up in my world now, in this world of politics and media, particularly with the Missouri versus Biden, and you were the co-author, which I'm keen to get into. But I wondered if we might get a little bit of a bit of your story, because the other time that Missouri came up politically was after the killing of Michael Brown back in 2014. You obviously were not a senator then. You were a senator from 2023, but you were already in politics and you were involved in what happened after then. I was just curious, for viewers new to your work, maybe, what's your political journey?
Yeah, you're taking me back. So yeah, I got into politics. I wasn't really intending to run. I have a 20-year-old son, Steven, now, that was born. He was diagnosed with a rare genetic condition at about 5 months. And Steven to this day is nonverbal. He's on the autism spectrum. His epilepsy, that's his biggest issue, has seizures almost every day. Well, when he was really young, he would have these seizures, and he had one that lasted for 4 hours. And as a new dad, he was our first child. You go through this process of kind of discernment. What do you want to do with your life? And so for me, it was entering public life. So I ran for office and was able to work on some things. And because I was there, everything happened in Ferguson. I guess that's 11 years ago now. And what had happened, what I discovered, and I grew up near Ferguson. My grandfather was actually from Ferguson. So I grew up in this kind of blue collar working class North County area in St. Louis, in the St. Louis area. And what had happened was a lot of these municipalities were using their municipal courts to generate a lot of revenue. And I dubbed it this taxation by citation. So you get a speeding ticket, maybe you didn't show up. All of a sudden, a $100 ticket became a $1,000 ticket. I really took advantage of people who really couldn't, afford it. And the police officers didn't like it that I talked to. They didn't go to the police academy to write traffic tickets all day long. It was really being driven by these bureaucrats, these low-level bureaucrats in municipalities to drive revenue. And it created a rift between the community and the courts and in some instances the police. So we were able to enact some reforms to say that, look, you only a certain percentage of your revenue as a city can come from traffic tickets and fines. And it really kind of united the political spectrum. It's something that got done. It's probably a real meaningful reform from that time. And I viewed it from a conservative lens because I viewed it as government taking advantage of the citizenry, right? Like, and so a bunch of people came at it for different reasons. But yeah, that was kind of the first thing that I was probably known for in Missouri on a larger level than just representing the area that I represented in St. Louis. So
it's not actually to do with race, because I'd understood those reforms as a response to the feeling that there was racial inequality and there was systemic racism, and that
this was really getting at, for me, the root cause of how bureaucrats within government they had traffic ticket quotas. So think about this. A police officer they would lose their job if they didn't write enough speeding tickets per month. And so what it was doing was driving a wedge, a level of distrust that had kind of opened up between the community and their municipal courts, their government, and played out on the street level sometimes. Because the police officers that I talked to that were supportive of the legislation actually said, I want to do community policing. I want to walk the beat. I want to build these relationships. I don't want to be set up on an interstate or on a road pulling people over all day long to raise money for this city.
But why was it deemed a response to racial tensions?
Because when you dug a little bit deeper, you realize that there had been a breakdown of some trust. And you try to figure out what is the reason for that. Well, it turns out that municipalities like Ferguson and others were using their municipal courts to drive revenue. So it wasn't about good government. It was about money. And for me, that certainly struck a chord. And I do think it helped move St. Louis forward. I think a lot of people use that. Ironically, the Black Lives Matter movement was born there. That is not. And but that is, and we'll get into this, I'm sure, with some of this NGO network. That was the first time you saw out-of-state groups funded by this network basically bring people in to fill up a camera, a TV screen, and created an issue that a lot of people locally were like, wait a minute, we didn't ask for all these people to come here. We didn't ask for the violence that came to our community from. It's sort of like later on, you saw in other instances where all of a sudden bricks were showing up at protests, right, for people to throw through windows later in the day. Where did the bricks come from?
Wait, are we fast forwarding to 2020 here? Or
Yeah,
2014?
yes. So, but I'm saying is in 2014 was really the first time you saw this, right? And that was dubbed, Black Lives Matter was dubbed during the Ferguson protests, right? And it then morphed into something that was unrecognizable from the people that I was talking to, who said, look, I don't like the idea that I'm just simply part of this revenue generating scheme that my city put together to pull people over all day long to generate money. If you want money for your municipality, go ask the people for it with a tax increase, and they'll say yes or they'll say no. But this backdoor way of generating revenue using the police to go do it was not popular with the people or with the police. So I felt like it was a constructive thing to do.
Was it a community that was more African American, which is why
what's interesting is Ferguson actually was pretty racially mixed. Had tended to be more African American in the last decade or so, but Ferguson, it got put on the map because of everything that happened with the Michael Brown thing. But traditionally, it had been a community that had, and in many ways it was had a bit of a renaissance going on. People were buying older homes and fixing them up, and there were a lot of people in the community who cared very deeply about it, who were horrified by what happened with some of the people, of course, who came in, the rioters who came in the evenings.
Okay, so it wasn't an official Black Lives Matter organization. This is the sort of slogan, BLM, and that came out of Ferguson.
That came out of Ferguson.
But you're saying was parachuted into Ferguson.
Yes, absolutely. So
by who?
This is probably Soros network that we've more fully understood now. This network of NGOs that were created, that were funded through a bunch of different sources, that connected people, literally brought people in who were not from Ferguson. And a lot of people locally resented that, right? They resented that because they may have been there during the day talking about something or wanting to have a conversation, but in the evening what happened was...
A quick interruption to tell you about the sponsor of this interview, Native Path Hydrate. Most people know that staying hydrated is essential to nearly every bodily function, but 75% of Americans still do not consume enough fluid daily. As we age, natural bodily changes make staying hydrated even harder, especially without artificial additives or excess Sugars. That's where Native Path comes in with extra help. Native Path's Hydrate is not just another drink mix. It is a thoughtfully designed formula packed with BCAAs and all 9 essential amino acids to help with muscle recovery and overall vitality. Plus, it's completely sugar-free and 100% natural. With their Native Hydrate product, you can fuel your body with essential electrolytes at the cellular level for overall vitality. Unlike other hydration drink mixes that are designed for marathon runners and contain upwards of 1,000 milligrams of sodium, Native Hydrate contains just 230 milligrams of sodium for optimal daily hydration. Regain your hydration free of artificial flavors, sugars, and dyes. It's only 5 calories per serving, and every order comes with a 365-day money-back guarantee, so you can try it risk-free. Visit nativehydrate.com/Marshall to see what Native Hydrate could do for your health. Now back to the interview.
To have a conversation, but in the evening what happened was the violence broke out, and from that then Soros elected prosecutors across the country, including in St. Louis. Now she's not there anymore. Kim Gardner, I had run-ins with her then when I became Attorney General later, but these prosecutors then came in and they didn't prosecute violent crime. So then you of course would have, and this played out in 2020 when you saw in the wake of George Floyd, right? You saw protests, riots, no prosecutions, this chaos that unfolded, which of course for many people, they like that chaos. They feel like government then can come in and fill the void. But if you go back to 2014 when that was happening in real time, that was the first time you saw that kind of thing. I wanted to do something constructive that brought people together, and going after this municipal court system, this taxation by citation, did that because it addressed the concerns of both the police and people who had legitimate concerns.
Okay, so let's just unpack a couple of things. So you talk about Soros and funding BLM. Now, as far as I've looked into it, the evidence we have of Soros funding BLM is through the Tides organization, where he donated something like 27 million, and this was exposed by Doge, I believe.
Mm-hmm.
And he was funding through Tides. No, it's less clear than that. He had previously funded Tides. He wasn't direct, or the Open Societies Foundation wasn't directly responsible for Tides, but Tide was given money by the government to the tune of 27 million, I think in 2020, which then went to BLM and funded various nefarious activity. You're referring to something else, though, right? Because that's later. Because in 2014, what exactly is the link between Soros?
Well, there are a number of organizations on the left that were affiliated with Soros and this idea of, I think, fomenting discord in communities, exploiting situations on the ground for their own political advantage. So the groups specifically, I'd have to go back and look now, that were actually involved with bringing people in who were not from Ferguson. It's not to say that, by the way, there weren't people organically that were they're upset about something, but the whole narrative of hands up, don't shoot was a lie. Like, that didn't happen. Michael Brown had charged a police officer, and this is, by the way, Obama's administration, their DOJ came to this conclusion that he had charged a police officer, tried to get his gun, and that's how Michael Brown was killed that day, right? There was no situation, but this narrative, and by the way, is probably an example of how important it is if those situations arise to communicate with the public quickly, because that narrative took over very quickly, that somehow is a situation where a young black man was standing with his arms raised and was gunned down in the middle of the street. That did not happen. And the DOJ report, pointed to all that too. But I think for me, at the time, as a lawyer, as somebody who grew up in that community, I was certainly compelled to try to do something to try to address what was at the bottom of a lot of this distrust that had developed. And for me, it had been, again, a government that was kind of hell-bent on extracting as much from people, including the poorest among us, to fuel their desires without the courage to ask the public to go do it. And that probably, honestly, if you look at some of the fights that I took on later on, whether it was at the federal level, at the state level, or at the local level, was fueled by, I think, my desire to push back against governments or agencies or bureaucracies that got too big and were forcing their will upon people. And we would push back in a number of different ways. But that was probably my first entry into that. There was an opportunity to fix something, and I think we did.
I'm keen to get into what needs to be fixed. But so 2020 comes along. You've seen this all happen in 2014. What's your reaction then? It sounds like the way you're describing it, Michael Brown was a sort of precursor to George Floyd in some ways. 2020 erupts. Where are you?
I'm the Attorney General in Missouri now. So I had run for statewide office and had been Attorney General for about a year. And you saw there was a off-duty police officer who was murdered in some of these riots in St. Louis a couple days after the protests erupted. And what I saw then was a local, like a black police officer who was who'd been called to help his friend to protect his store that day. David Dorn was his name.
Was the friend or the officer?
He was the officer, and was there to protect the store. And he was murdered. And this played out over a number of days. And I had been, St. Louis had been experiencing a lot of, before this even, an increase in violent crime, principally because there was a prosecutor there, a Soros-funded prosecutor named Kim Gardner. And there were many of them at this point across the country who had been funded, who just was not interested in prosecuting violent crime. As Attorney General of Missouri, every state law is a little bit different. We didn't have what's called original jurisdiction to prosecute murders. The legislature would have to give us, but that was what local prosecutors had. And before all this, I had offered to handle some of the cases that weren't prosecuted. Of course, she wasn't interested in that. We had developed a partnership with the federal prosecutors to have lawyers in our office prosecute violent federal crimes like carjacking. So we were doing what we could, but we were somewhat limited. But what we saw then was, in the wake of that, of those riots in the evenings in particular, there were just no real prosecutions happening. And then, which is probably seared into the memories of some folks, the McCloskeys, I don't know if you remember this, a group of sort of Black Lives Matter protesters were on their way to intimidate the mayor at the mayor's house. She subsequently found out, had to move out of her home because of all this stuff, this intimidation. She moved out. But on their way there on a private street, they were threatening to kill this guy's dog. He comes out. He's got the pink polo on. I don't know if you remember this. In America, people remember this. He's got an AR. The wife had a handgun, and this image is captured in 2020 that was kind of a flashpoint. Well, the prosecutor, by the way, in Missouri under the Castle Doctrine, you absolutely have a right to do that, to defend your property if you're being threatened, and they were. And that's what he was doing. She chose to prosecute him, and no one was hurt that day, but wasn't really prosecuting these violent rioters in the evenings. And so it was on full display. Kind of St. Louis, Missouri was again in the national spotlight. And so we kind of jumped into that and spoke out against that kind of injustice. And people deserve to feel safe. But you had these prosecutors that, again, during that time period, weren't interested in prosecuting violent crime. Also, under the backdrop of COVID, you might remember, people were told, wear a mask, stay inside, don't go out. But all of a sudden, if you were showing up to a Black Lives Matter protest or something in the evening, you had all these academics come out and say, well, actually, it's okay if you're doing that.
Yeah.
So I think for a lot of people, that's when it hit them, that a lot of the things that were happening during COVID was all a ruse. It was all about power and control and who you wanted to anoint the good guy or the bad guy. And anyway, that summer was enlightening, and of course it played out in the months later too.
I sense coming to America, and forgive me because I'm not American, and I hope you don't mind me commenting on your wonderful country, but a sense of what happened in 2020, that there hasn't really been a sense of dealing with it properly. I mean, you mentioned one murder that happened of a police officer, a black police officer, no less, in the time of Black Lives Matter.
Right.
25 people were killed between George Floyd and the end of October, 19 of whom were in the first 2 weeks, and $2 billion worth of damage, a lot of that to black businesses, no less. So it seems like a taboo topic still, maybe not in your circles, but in circles that I've been around, it's not something that's really been grappled with necessarily. But the issue of activist judges, and you mentioned Kim Gardner.
Yeah.
This is something I want to understand, because at the moment, as we talk, I understand Elon Musk is in Wisconsin dealing with a state Supreme Court judge who he doesn't want elected. Now, again, I want you to explain this to me like I'm a dummy, like I'm a 5-year-old. what the activist judges, or maybe I don't fully understand the American system, so perhaps coming from that point of view, is it, the Supreme Court? I understand that there are some conservatives and there's some liberal Supreme Court judges. Everyone has a bias. So what that they have a bias, and is it a bad thing that they're elected? What is the what's the deal with activist judges?
So I think you start with the idea that in our constitutional framework, we've got three branches of government. We've got the legislative branch, which is supposed to make the laws, the executive branch is supposed to execute those laws, and the judicial branch meant to interpret those laws if there's some sort of constitutional question, right? Does this statute conflict with your ability under the First Amendment to speak your mind? That's sort of they're the referee in that way. And in this system, we have checks and balances. So each branch with the idea of separation of powers is to sort of check the other branch's power. Our system of federalism, where you have all these 50 different states, where a state can sue the federal government for maybe doing something that the state, they think violates the citizens of their state's rights. So the point of all that is to spread out power, because you think about where we came from, right? We rebelled against a centralized power. We rebelled against a king. We thought that was unjust because they had all this power. We weren't represented. And it was meant to disperse that power. So no one branch or no one person ever got too powerful, right? It was spread it out. So conservatives, if I were to argue sort of a judicial philosophy, is that conservative judges, they've sort of restrained themselves to say, I am deciding what the law is, how it's written, interpreting it as it, not how I want it to be, right? The legislative branch gets to do that. They get to decide what the law is. Activist liberal judges act as almost sort of a super legislator. They say, you know what? That isn't, what they clearly intended here was something else, or we think this is unjust, so therefore we'll rule a different way, even though the legislative branch never actually said that. So the real conflict you're seeing right now in the American system is two schools of thought. One is that judges should be restrained in their view to interpret statutes as they are written, not how they want them to be, and another branch that wants to sort of move the ball forward without that level of accountability. Now, this has been going on for a while. I would argue that one of the few things, and I'm a conservative, the left controls all the cultural institutions for the most part, right? You've got Hollywood, you've got higher ed, you've got K through 12 now. K through 12 education's been dominated by this radical critical race theory and DEI trainings among administrators and staff. All these sort of cultural institutions are lined up. One thing conservatives have done, I think, a little bit better is through organizations like Federal Society and others, there's sort of a bench, there's a farm team of judges that can be appointed. Trump did this in his first term. He's going to do it now, that are more judicially restrained. They believe in originalism and, the original intent of the Constitution and statutes that are written by interpreting the text as textualists. So we've done a pretty good job of that, but the left now is upset about that. And they're employing different means, right? So when you see Chuck Schumer, who's the minority leader now, stand in front of the Supreme Court threatening the court by saying, you will reap a whirlwind if you decide wrongly, or when Roe v. Wade or the Dobbs decision was being contemplated and considered, you saw threats, you saw trying to intimidate justices, you saw assassination attempts afterwards. So the left has gotten used to, until very recently, we have a more conservative court, of dominating the Supreme Court also, right? Roe v. Wade, the principal argument against it all the time was that these 9 justices took away the ability for each state to kind of weigh in on this very important political question, right? They took it away and made up a right that did not exist in the Constitution. If you want to amend the United States Constitution to say something, there's a process to go do it. These 9 justices, they're not accountable, don't get to start making things up. So bringing it back to Wisconsin now, they elect their Supreme Court judges in Wisconsin. And so there's all these important questions that come before a state Supreme Court, like redistricting, or if you throw out voter ID, if the legislature passes a voter ID bill saying, hey, you got to prove who you are, actually, like you would if you're flying on a plane when you go vote, they say, oh, no, you can't do that. That violates the Constitution in some way, shape, or form. So a lot of important questions are decided at the state level, not just at the federal level. And that's at the heart of what's going on in Wisconsin right now.
Okay, so he's not necessarily against he'll say he's against activist judges, Elon, but what he actually wants is a conservative judge. And your argument is that the conservative judges are behaving themselves, and the liberal judges.
Yeah, it's not a political. Yeah, I think to probably take it away, it's not a political position, right? I don't want any judge, regardless of their ideological point of view, making stuff up, right? Because at that point, then none of this matters. Now, the system of checks and balances in our constitutional structure doesn't really matter anymore if one judge or 3 judges or 9 justices just get to make stuff up every 5 years or 10 years, right? It's supposed to be rooted, again, in the laws that are passed, because we believe in this country that we, the people, that the people are the sovereign, that there's no king or queen that's been, through and some of our friends across the pond might disagree, right? But who's been bestowed as the sovereign. We believe that collectively we make these decisions, and that is what, that's what should rule the day. So basically, it's not a conservative point of view like, oh, I think lower taxes are better than higher taxes. When you mean conservative justice, basically means I'm restraining myself to interpret the laws as they are written, not how I want them to be. So the railing on activist judges are the judges that say, I'm not constrained by that at all. I want my ideology to win the day regardless of what the law says.
So presumably there are activists, there must be, could you think of an activist judge who's a conservative? Or rather, can you think of a liberal judge who's not an activist?
There are probably some judges that have been appointed over the years by a Democrat administration that hasn't, overtly abused their authority in that way. There are probably some.
I kind of asked this because if I was on the other side and highly suspicious of Elon Musk, the conservatives very happy to say George Soros, this, that, and the other. And don't get me wrong, I've got a lot of problems with George Soros, but the liberals will be like, Elon Musk is funding it. And for them now, Elon Musk is literally Hitler. And it's like, they could spin this a complete inversion of what you're saying, the opposite of what you're saying, and say we've got to get rid of the conservative judges for these reasons, that they're activists. Is that not a?
I don't think that's not an accurate comparison. I think that if it's just a tit for tat, I guess you could make that argument. But I think truthfully, conservatives would argue that we don't want a judge to make stuff up just to rule on our side. We want the judge to actually, like, for example, when I was Attorney General in Missouri, we sued on a number of things. We sued the Biden administration on the vaccine mandate, forcing 100 million Americans to get the COVID shot. And our argument was, look, the executive branch just doesn't have this authority. If you want that to be the law, Congress should have to implement that, just like student loan debt forgiveness. I don't want some conservative judge to agree that a president could necessarily do that if they've never been bestowed that authority, right? Nobody ever gave one person the ability to write away $500 billion worth of student loan debt, but that's what the Biden administration was doing to curry favor. So I guess the difference is the guardrails are just exist for a conservative judge or justice that views the law again as it's written, not how they want it to be. Whereas those guardrails don't really exist for an activist liberal judge, because they believe that they're imposing that will is for the greater good. And that's the difference.
Did you win either of the cases when
we
you
did?
Sued?
We won both of those at the Supreme Court. In addition, we brought that Missouri versus Biden lawsuit on censorship.
Which you didn't win.
They sent it back because of standing issues. They didn't actually rule on the merits, meaning they didn't say you win or you lose. They say, we're not sure Missouri has standing. But if you read some of those opinions, they're justices like the lower courts that actually did rule on the merits, said this was Orwellian.
Let's do the Missouri Biden
as
case.
a separate deal.
Just to re-explain to listeners. So this was after the Twitter files, and those Twitter files exposed the interactions between the government, the White House, I believe at that time, and big tech in Silicon Valley, specifically Twitter, right? That's
so correct. Actually, the lawsuit predated Elon Musk buying Twitter and the Twitter files. So what had happened, but I mean, clearly Musk buying Twitter and then the release of the Twitter files and the journalism that went along through it was monumental. But if you go back to 2022 in May, when we filed the lawsuit, this had been sort of a conspiracy theory, as many of these things at the time were that ended up being true. I was bothered by, I would see Jen Psaki, who at the time was the press secretary, would stand up at the podium and talk about how they were flagging things for Facebook and that this was misinformation and disinformation. And then there was an idea floated of the Disinformation Governance Board here in the United States of America, a board of people who were going to decide what the truth was.
I remember this.
And there was that Mary Poppins character who was like singing a supercalifragilistic song. It was creepy, but it got a lot.
Orwellian.
It was. So we filed the lawsuit. And the important thing about that was the judge ordered discovery before the temporary restraining order was issued, meaning we got to see under the hood before we just argued before the court. That was a big deal because that meant 20,000 documents were released, where for the first time, as we released them, the public could see the coordination efforts and collusion efforts and coercion, quite frankly, that took place with these big tech platforms behind the scenes. You had the Surgeon General of the United States texting high-ranking social media executives himself. You had threats being made by the digital director saying, at the highest levels of government, and you know who I mean, at the Oval Office is very concerned about this. Take it down. There was, and F-bombs were being dropped. And like, this was shocking, really, because most of it honestly had to do with COVID and the vaccine and shutting down any dissent about the efficacy of masks, whether or not masks work or not. An online debate was not to be had. The regime's narrative was to be carried out and policed. And what they did was they outsourced a lot of that because in America, your First Amendment rights, it means that the government can't suppress your speech. But they also don't get to outsource that to big tech companies, or as they were doing with universities, nonprofits like Stanford and University of Washington, that were doing some of the dirty work for them. They were flagging this stuff. Then you had this whole network of fact checkers that they were working with to say, shut this guy down. And the irony now, of course, is in the new administration, RFK Jr., who was silenced and deplatformed.
Was he part of the Missouri case?
He wasn't actually a plaintiff, but he had his own lawsuit. But Jay Bhattacharya, who's now the head of NIH, he was one of our plaintiffs in that lawsuit. He was at Stanford, and he was being silenced because he made the bold declaration that natural immunity was still a thing. And they tried to. So I think if you go back.
RFK was, he claimed to be the first person silenced by the Biden administration. And so he was.
And there are documents to that effect. Early on in January of 2021, they went after RFK specifically. They got his YouTube channel shut down. Because they didn't want anybody disagreeing with them. That is, and I don't care if you're a conservative or a liberal or a Republican or Democrat or anything in between, that ought to scare the bejesus out of people. The government was that powerful and working with some of the biggest companies in the history of the world to silence speech. That's exactly what was happening. So we laid it all out. We got an initial ruling from the court. It was affirmed by the appellate court, and the judge commented that this was Orwellian. And perhaps the greatest example of censorship in U.S. history. And then, of course, the Supreme Court gets it. They hear all the arguments and they say, we're sympathetic, or maybe we think this is just trying to influence and it's not coercion, but we're going to send it back down to the lower courts. And so that's where it stands now. So, but I think that more than anything, the big victory of that lawsuit was it exposed this stuff for the first time. And then Twitter Files just blew it out of the water.
So we had Jed Rubenfeld on the show, who was a constitutional lawyer, and he explained that it fell down because of the word coercion, and that because there was they couldn't say that definitionally that the government coerced big tech, except if you actually read what was exposed, it was borderline bullying. It wasn't technically coercion. Like they didn't have to. They weren't threatened with like prison time or anything like this, or like actual physical threats. It was just like a letter at the door. You need to take.
But here's what's interesting about, and here's the arguments that we made. And by the way, they didn't actually rule on. That was the argument against it. You would say that Missouri shouldn't win this lawsuit because it wasn't actually coercion. It was just a suggestion. Well, here's the thing. What made this a little bit unique is and we argued this, these big tech companies are in a very different situation in the sense that they have what's called Section 230 protections. Meaning, if you're CBS News and you manipulate a 60 Minutes interview that can harm a candidate, or you lie about somebody, you can be sued for that because you're a publisher. Back in the 1990s, when the internet was becoming a thing, Congress enacted a law under the Telecommunications Act, said, if you're going to be a platform where people can come on and just sort of express their point of view, you're not going to be liable for litigation. You can't be sued for that. You're just a platform. But so anyway, the government was holding out these Section 230 protections. They'd say something like, "Hey, that's a nice little tech company you got there. Be ashamed if something happened to it. Like maybe you are now subject to antitrust investigations, or maybe you lose your Section 230 protections." These were big sticks that they were wheeling. So I just never bought the argument that somehow this wasn't really coercion, because they knew exactly what was on the line if they didn't comply.
Yeah.
And that was sort of the underlying legal issue. But however you fell on that, where you thought it was coercion or not coercion, what no one could deny was what was, shown to be the efforts to control the narrative by the government officials with the big tech partners. Yeah. That was shocking, I think.
So I would say that no one would also deny that, if not legally, at least the spirit of free speech was betrayed through all of that. And this then comes to the sticky situation, I think, under the Trump administration, particularly with regards to Mahmoud Khalil, who is a former Columbia University student acting as a spokesperson for Columbia University apartheid divest, who has been detained by ICE. There's been several charges, or I'm not sure of charges, but there's sort of accusations. Tom Homan said something, and then Marco Rubio said something different. And as it stands, as I've understood it right now, it's because they're claiming he lied on his application visa to come into the United States. Now, I think that there's probably several legal ways that they can deport Mahmoud Khalil, and legally it's probably justifiable. But it seems to me that the spirit of free speech has been betrayed with his treatment. Do you think I'm wrong to think that?
I do, and I'm pretty much a free speech absolutist, right? Now, you got to remember, though, from a legal perspective, that is granted to citizens of the United States, right? So if you're here as a guest, and this is kind of what you're getting at, if you're here as a guest, just as I might be as a guest on a student visa or some other temporary nature in a foreign country, you're on a different footing than somebody who is a citizen of that country. You can be deported for a lot of things, right? I think the issue here is the activities that were involved. If this was just about speaking up on the town square, I don't think we'd be here right now. But when you're shutting down buildings, when you're having these sort of tent cities and these camp-ins that were happening, right? That's a different thing. That's a different thing.
I haven't seen any evidence that he was directly, I think you could say indirectly. I think you can say that he's associated with organizations who did that, but I haven't found any evidence that he himself has done that. And trust me, I looked into this.
Yeah, no, and I think that, quite frankly, there were a lot of people here on student visas that were part of the Black Lives Matter riots back in 2020 that probably ought to be deported as well, right? I think that if, again, people have the ability to speak their mind. When that crosses over into violence, that's a whole different category. And also, if you're a guest in the country, that's a different category as well, too. So you're never going to get an argument from me, even if something I find really objectionable and offensive, like part of the First Amendment is defending somebody's right to say those awful things, right? And the ACLU used to do this, right? The ACLU used to actually stick up for people, then they got woke, and now they don't really do that anymore. And so I'm 49, which in the Senate's relatively young, but it's not that young anymore. But growing up in the 90s, in college, I was always a little envious. Liberals kind of had the high ground on free speech. Not anymore. Not anymore. It's just a lever of power now that can be yanked away at a moment's notice. And also, I think you've seen this sort of political correctness that has turned into censorship now, this kind of wrong think, this narrowing of the bandwidth of what's acceptable. That was born in the 90s, and now you've got a couple generations later. And I just think at this point, it's about carrying the narrative of the regime, period. Nothing else matters.
Yeah, I mean, certainly before Trump came to power, it's just going to be curious to see whether that maintains now that Trump's in the position of power, MAGA reigns. You've been one thing that I've been personally very excited about is Doge, and you've been very outspoken on Doge and the USAID clear-ups, and I was wondering whether you had any updates, like what's the current situation, what can we expect next?
Well, I think they were very smart, and Elon is I've talked to him about it. I think there's no personal benefit for this guy to go do this. I mean, you look and see what's happening now, where people are firebombing Tesla dealerships. I think he came to the conclusion that spending $2 trillion we don't have every year in America is not a recipe for success. In fact, we're going to bankrupt the country if we keep doing it. So let's go find the waste, fraud, and abuse, which, by the way, shouldn't be like a Republican thing. Like Bill Clinton did this. Bill Clinton eliminated hundreds of thousands of positions back in the 90s, but it wasn't controversial. Barack Obama talked about some of this stuff too. But I think what's happened, and we can talk about Doge specifically, but I know you've had guests on previous podcasts that have talked about this. It's sort of this roaming desire now of the left to find some new controversy to glom onto for the outrage and the protests and this constant churning you see from the left now. It's just grabbing onto this because they got nothing left. There's no leader. There's no agenda. It's just hair on fire. We're objecting to this. But I do think that Doge was smart to start with USAID. There's just no way to defend the amount of money that was being spent on these causes that don't further American interests at all. Like spending $2 million a year on Guatemalan sex changes, right, is crazy. Billions of dollars for DEI programming in Burma, a DEI Sesame Street in Iraq. I mean, I think that this was a real threat to permanent Washington. And what I mean by that here in this town is this establishment type that holds on to these levers of power they've gotten used to, that funds the pet causes that they have. And you have this revolving door of people go in and out of government, and then go to this NGO network, and USAID funds all of it. And so I think they were right to go after it first. And now you're seeing a court ruling affirmed the ability to go in and make these necessary programming changes. Marco Rubio has been pretty clear about this. I think they'll end up with about 13% of the revenue that they had before would go to things that actually further American interests around the world. And there are some, but they're certainly not the excesses and abuses that have been highlighted by Doge. So I think there's more to do here, but USAID is going down. I think it's a good thing. I think it's been abused for a very, very, very long time. And so anyway, it's a good development. And there's so much waste, and I think there's so much fraud that's happening.
Well, some of it's been caught up in the courts. And so it's particularly those when it's been assigned for treatments on diseases and, let's say, HIV, I believe, in Africa, and the details, unfortunately, I forget at the moment. But they are things which, if the treatment stops, it affects the patients. And so, do you think there might have been an overreach in some of it, or was it any of it done too hastily?
Well, I think part of it was the backstory here is USAID would not let the Department of Government Efficiency in to look at the books. They viewed themselves as this purely independent agency. And the response was, we have no other choice then, which is to pause everything until we get a look at it. So you will then leave the building, we'll pause everything, and then we're going to get a good look at it. And I think they have then restarted some things, right? And Elon and others have been very open about the idea of, as senators, as representatives, if you see something, make sure you're communicating with us. And so I think they have a very open door policy, but I think this nature, again, not to get too much in the weeds, but a lot of these agencies view themselves as accountable to no one, right? They view themselves. So really what's happening now is what used to be USAID is now being folded up into what should have been always understood to be the case, which is the State Department. So Marco Rubio is ultimately somebody who can make these changes if changes need to be made, and there's some level of accountability. All this, I think, at the end of the day, there's so much swirling all at once, all the time right now.
Yeah.
But when you really step back, I think 6 months from now or a year from now, we'll say, thank goodness we had a mechanism to kind of get control over this and see what's working, what's not working, and people can actually be accountable. Because for so long, it's just been kind of on autopilot.
The big idea, the big plan, as far as Elon said, is to cut down government expenditure by $2 trillion. And he hopes to cut it down by $1 trillion, I think, within the year. Mm-hmm. And he wants to be out even sooner than that. Yeah. I think he said he wants to be out in 130 days, something like that. All of this is because the government spending is so out of whack with what's coming in that there's a serious threat of a debt crisis. Is there something bigger that needs to be considered with the American economic system at the moment? Do you think it's enough to kind of turn around what's going on?
Well, I think that we tend to overcomplicate this a little bit, and I'll try to use just a few numbers. So before the pandemic in 2019, the United States of America was spending about $4 trillion a year. Okay. Not 1919, 2019, 4 trillion. We now take in over 5 trillion, okay, a year. We're spending over 7 trillion a year. So in 5 years, not even 5 years, expenditures for the federal government went from $4 trillion to $7 trillion. By no one's math is that sustainable. It's just not. So I think where we're at right now is what many of us are saying on the more conservative side is, what if we just got back to pre-pandemic spending plus inflation and population growth? Like, what if we just did that? That would get you over $1 trillion down the road. What Elon Musk and finding the waste and the fraud and the abuse gets you further down the road. This is doable. You can actually have a balanced budget. It may not happen like tomorrow, but it might happen in a year or 2 or 3 years. That would be the impact for like regular people is immense, because the government's not such a big borrower anymore. All of a sudden, mortgage rates and what people pay to buy a home goes down. What it costs to buy a car goes down. Like, all of a sudden, the people that I try to fight for, the people I grew up around, are the ones that are really struggling to make ends meet. Inflation's gone through the roof, and there's been 2 drivers of inflation: government spending and this war on domestic energy production that the Biden administration did. So if you open up domestic energy production, and you control government spending, guess what? Inflation goes way, way down. And I think that's ultimately the goal here.
What's the war on domestic energy?
Oh, the Biden administration sort of choking off these pipelines, the ability for America has all the energy we'll ever need. And by the way, liquefied natural gas, we can export to our European
You already do.
Yeah, we do, but we could do it at a much greater level. So when you kind of limit the permitting for new LNG ports or facilities, or to try to find more LNG in America, you're limiting our ability to do as much of it as we probably could. And so if you open that up and you kind of flood the market with clean energy, that's just going to be if you care about that stuff, right? Nobody produces it cleaner than the United States of America, because what they end up doing is importing like Venezuelan oil, which is like, a lot dirtier, and critical minerals that are mined in other places that don't have some of the safeguards, right? It comes from somewhere. So America could really be this catalyst for energy. And if we controlled spending, I think if you want to talk about how America becomes super prosperous again, that's it. Like, that's the formula. Yeah. And all these regulations that have been created by these agencies that don't feel like they're accountable to anybody, or moving a political agenda that Congress never voted on, that's the root cause of all this. So kind of winding it all back to this administrative state that exists, this unaccountable nature of these bureaucrats, that drives a lot of expenses and why things are so costly now.
Your energy is 5 times cheaper than it is in my country. So if you can get it cheap.
Well, you've seen this. Well, in Europe, I mean, look, Europe, you've seen this deindustrialization in Europe.
Yeah, it's suicide.
It is. It makes no sense. No country in the history of the world has ever done this, because think about it. Wars have been fought since the beginning of time for natural resources. And so when you see these Western countries say, you know what, we're not going to do that anymore. China's building 2 coal-fired plants every week. Like, anyway, it's just, it's madness.
Yeah. Don't get me started on what's going on in my country. But you mentioned Venezuela in passing, and this has come up in the news because there's been Tom Homan and the Trump administration have been deporting specifically it's the Tren de Aragua Jaguar gang. And Bukele has just before we spoke, I saw him put a video tweet out of receiving the gang members.
Yeah.
And this was a big part of J.D. Vance's and Trump's campaign trail to get rid of illegals, and certainly violent criminal illegals. Caught up in that, there's been at least one example I think it happens to be one 30-year-old Venezuelan who was here going through the asylum process. And I think he's a gay guy and fleeing because he was gay, and he'd been an anti-Maduro activist in Venezuela. And he got caught up and has ended up taken to Salvador. Now, it seems to me on the surface is that this is a consequence of, assuming that you agree that that's a problem, but it seems to me that is a consequence of everything happening very quickly. And in the heat of the moment, there are being mistakes made. Maybe it's 1 or 2, but that's still a big mistake. I wondered what your opinion was on cases like that.
Well, I mean, obviously, I can't speak to that. I don't know the facts of that. I mean, accepting what you said to be true, I mean, clearly that I don't think that was the intention for that individual. But the truth is, this is now also a consequence of, again, we talked about NGOs fueling, not just in America, but in Europe too, fueling this mass migration, right? They're literally, USAID was funding organizations that would give debit cards and fuel the pathway for literally millions of people to come here illegally. 15 to 20 million in 4 years is an insane number, including well over 1 million people, like truly violent criminal pasts. And the nexus with Venezuela.
Well over a million, you said?
Yes, in America. And the nexus, of course, with Venezuela is, the truth is, Caracas was the most violent city in the world not that long ago. What did they do? They emptied their prisons. And they first went to Colombia and then here in the United States. So these gangs that were terrorizing communities in Colorado and chopping people's fingers off and raping women and murdering people, these are some of the most violent of the violent, and they're here. And so I think the Trump administration has been very clear. Job number one, and I was with them a lot on the campaign trail, was we're going to deal with this. This is going to be a mass deportation exercise. We're not going to allow this to happen in this country. And by the way, from a legal perspective, the president has every authority under federal immigration law to do this stuff. I think these court cases that are being thrown out now, there's maybe some short-lived wins here or there for the left, but this is like, it's funny you bringing up this too, because we're talking about, think about the things we're talking about. We're talking about illegal immigration. We're talking about free speech. We haven't really talked about foreign policy yet, but all these things are very connected. The left is spread out now worldwide, very well funded to move a lot of these initiatives across board. You see in Europe now this clamping down on free speech like we've never seen before. We saw the vast censorship enterprise here in the United States. You see this mass migration effort. These people who don't actually believe in the same things that Western culture sort of believed in forever. They don't believe in borders. They think borders are just sort of arbitrary lines drawn on a map. They don't believe in the sovereignty of countries. And so all of this stuff now is coming to a head. And that, to me, is what this election was about, right? So we talked about the energy that's here in Washington, D.C. right now. The American people and my country here had a choice. And we weren't arguing about little things. Like, we weren't arguing about small stuff. We were talking about big things, because the Democrats said if they won, here's what they were going to do. They were going to eliminate the filibuster in the United States Senate. They would have a permanent majority. They would add states to the union for more members in the Senate. They were going to have open borders. They were going to pack the United States Supreme Court to make sure all the decisions aligned with exactly how they want to do. So this was like a big decision. All the while they were trying to jail their chief political opponent, President Trump, throw him in jail for the rest of his life. The American people sat back and they were in that jury box and they had to consider this really important question, and they delivered a landslide. So President Trump is doing exactly what he said he would do, right? And immigration and clamping down on the border is chief among it. So I think you're going to see more of these. There's a lot more bad guys who are here. And I think the media, and I'm not talking about you, but they're going to try to find an example or two here or there of a mom and a daughter that's swept up in something.
Well, you can say it is actually me. I brought it up.
Well, no, I know.
No,
but I'm saying
me,
they're waiting. They're waiting. And as somebody that believes in doing things the right way, of course, there are going to be examples that then need to be addressed. But truth be told, when you've moved 15 to 20 million people here, drastic measures need to be taken. And I think that's where we're at.
Well, I don't know if this will have paid any attention. People in America would have realized this, but the Overton window on how we talk about deporting illegal immigration, J.D. Vance talking about it, Trump talking about it in the campaign trail, has actually changed it in Britain and Europe, whereas you just couldn't even talk about it 6 months ago. And now there are politicians saying, like, illegal, if you're in Britain illegally, deport. And that's no longer controversial to say. I mean, there's lefties who don't like it.
So I think what's interesting about that is I was talking to someone about this the other day. We talked a little bit about COVID. In the Biden's 4 years, I think they went so far to the left. I mean, all these things, right? They were forcing 100 million people to get this shot. They were just sort of bulldozing any constitutional, boundaries on one person forgiving $500 billion worth of student loan debt. The DEI agenda, merit was being dissolved. You had this sort of cultural Marxism seeping into our military and our schools of dividing the room by race. Who's the oppressor and who's the oppressed in this totem pole of like who was supposed to get a favored status or not. Thank God. I think that in November of 2024 in this country, the fever broke. They pushed it so far, so fast that the people rejected it. Thank God. But a lot of things that were taboo to talk about in say 2020, like remember if you said that the coronavirus, COVID-19 likely started in a lab in Wuhan. Like there's a lab there that was doing gain of function.
Racist.
And
even
it was like how you were calling for violence against like Chinese Americans or something. It was totally insane. But all of that was meant to shut down speech, to shut down voices that they didn't agree with. And I think, like I said, I think the fever broke. Musicians or comedians or artists who are certainly more in a silo that's much more liberal than you might be like in rural America. Even many of those folks said, you know what? Like there's something wrong here. Like I get to express a point of view and we can debate it and you may not agree with it, but this idea that like you can't say it is insane.
Yeah.
It's insane. So
I'm nervous to talk about foreign policy only because of how much time we actually have. But you mentioned it in passing there that we haven't talked about foreign policy. The one thing that I'll ask, given that we haven't got much time, is that, of course, we're just on the back of Signalgate. We've seen how the administration how they talk about Europe, how they talk about the rest of the world, which it changed my mind because I had thought that Trump, a lot of his rhetoric was intentional bluster to create incentives, and actually he had the effect of, let's say in Gaza, he actually got the Arab nations together to come up with a plan to rebuild Gaza. When it came to Europe, he actually got the Europeans to like man up and talk seriously about defense, and those are good things. And I think he was always right about NATO and all those things. But with Signalgate, it seems to me as like, oh, it might not just be bluster, like they don't like us that much. So they're really pissed off about our behavior, and some of it's legitimate. But it made me think, oh, actually, if push came to shove,
now as somebody from England, you're not using "our" to conflate England and France in the same way, are you?
I would never.
So no, don't get too European on me now.
I would never do that. But it certainly, I guess, it seemed to me in the eyes of the American administration, or these Hegseth, Rubio, J.D. Vance, they were lumping us in together, and that made me think, oh, actually, if Putin did decide to come into Europe, maybe the Americans are actually not going to, when push comes to the shove, do anything. Maybe they're too tired of it.
So I think the way to look at this is that. And I consider myself an American realist. I think the foreign policy establishment in this country has been dominated by sort of this globalist regime, this Wilsonian view that America can be everywhere all at once, all the time. It's just not true. So if you believe in scarcity, my point of view is, and I went to Munich, actually was there when J.D. Vance, I was like one of 3 people standing and clapping when he gave the speech.
Wow.
But the reason why I went there, among other colleagues, Republicans and Democrats that always sing the same tune and tell, in my view, the Europeans exactly what they want to hear and not the truth, was to go there as a truth teller and say, look, we're not retreating from the world, but what we're saying is that we have to focus on what are the core national interests of the United States of America first. That's an America first foreign policy, which is defending the homeland and understanding that the 21st century is going to be defined by who wins this great powers competition, the United States of America or communist China. That's the game, right? And it isn't to say that our European allies are being abandoned, but they need to step up. They need to step up. This idea that America can be this, security shield that you never pay for, and to subsidize, social welfare programs in Europe, that era is ending. This is not this is a feature, not a bug now. Now, I will say that that's a shock to the foreign policy establishment, even in this town. So maybe I'm in a minority. J.D. Vance and Trump are in a minority of like the think tank world in Washington, D.C. But when you get out into like the real country, like real America, that's exactly how people feel.
Yeah,
they feel
I'm sure of that.
So they feel like they've been taken advantage of. So
by the way, they have been taken advantage of.
Yes, absolutely. So I think that this is about turning to American realism and telling hard truths to our European friends. Right? This deindustrialization is killing Europe because they can't produce anything like you can talk about bumping up GDP, percentage of GDP for defense, right? But that can't go to pensions. Like pensions don't win wars, like munitions win wars. In Europe, and even Germany as of late, has abandoned this idea. Now, hopefully they're coming around, because if Europe actually did that and stepped up, that would mean, you know, a couple $100 billion a year the United States could turn towards our chief adversary, which is China. So I do think that American foreign policy is changing, but I think that's why you saw so many calls immediately for Hegseth to resign, which are totally ridiculous, is because they understand that we're entering a new phase here. We're entering a new era of foreign policy in this country, and that's a threat to many people, just like cutting off USAID is a threat to many people that kind of view the world similarly.
Right. So I've had a couple of criticisms of Trump, you might have noticed, although probably quite minor criticisms, really. But one other that I have, one thing I've been disappointed by is the Jeffrey Epstein files. And Pam Bondi, who was the Attorney General of Florida, and you gave a glowing...
I did. I introduced Pam. Yep,
you
absolutely.
introduced her at the Senate hearings. And... I think you gave a great criticism of what had come before her. But she said, she went on, I think she was on Fox, and she said, tomorrow we're going to release the Epstein files. The next day, a bunch of right-wing influencers go to the White House, get this white brochure that says the Epstein files, and open it up, and there's nothing in it. I was really disappointed by that. Do you think she made a mistake?
No, listen, I want to see all the information just like you do. But in understanding where Attorney General Bondi is right now is because, and I accept her at her word. Like I trust Pam. Like I'm telling you this, she is a warrior. She's got a backbone of steel. She's ready for the fight. In that instance in particular, because of the number of minors involved, I think that's their big concern. So I think there's more to come there. And I don't want to speak for the Department of Justice. My understanding is there's more to come there, but there's a lot of information relating to minors that don't have to do with the perpetrators.
Totally get that.
Yeah. And I think that's the issue.
But everyone listening will agree with that.
Yeah.
Right? And you've got to protect the victims, of course. But what didn't really add up then is, why do the whole hoo-ha with the files?
Yeah, I don't know. I don't.
Why did you go on the telly and promise that the next day there'd be, like, it just seemed like maybe the mistake was at least in promising something, if not the actual failure to deliver.
I have confidence that whatever can be released in that regard will be released. So it just may not be, I guess, as quickly as some people had hoped, and I think that's fair.
If I can ask a broad question, just to wrap this, tie it all together.
There's a lot we've got to tie together here.
We've got a lot to tie together. But one thing that's sort of been, maybe you've implied it, but I would like to understand it more explicitly, is the worldwide left movement that you've sort of talked about. And you kind of described that, and all of these different factions as being behind what you've been up against, you and your movement, the MAGA movement, Trump. And we have the similar equivalents in Britain, of course. I just wondered what your conception of that was. Is it just George Soros alone, or is it a philosophy? Is it what is it that drives this movement that you're up against? I think, again, sort of connecting it to at least some of the conversations we had today about whether it's sort of this foreign policy that existed for a long time, the causes that USAID was involved with, this corruption of this really important Western principle of free speech, mass migration. It is fueled not exclusively by George Soros, although he is, to the tune of hundreds of billions of dollars has funded it. But the U.S. government, in some ways through USAID, has contributed to a lot of this now, right? Is this movement where countries don't matter that much, right? They don't really believe in that. And that we're all world citizens, and that from an economic policy that who cares if you don't have the auto plant in your hometown anymore, because you just might be able to get something cheaper somewhere else. I think this has been really destructive for Western countries, and I think the left doesn't care about that. It's sort of the point. There's a reason why communist China is behind in themselves funding a lot of organizations that we highlighted in that hearing that I had on the Judiciary Committee, of noting the NGOs' role, the NGOs, plural,
role in a lot of the things that we see. There's a lot of incentive for the CCP to have unrest in the United States, right? I think a lot of it is from within.
Wait, sorry, what hearing was that?
Last week, was it last week? Last week. So I'm the chairman of the Constitution Subcommittee of the Judiciary Committee. So we had a hearing on censorship and NGOs. And I'm happy to get to you the content of that hearing. It further exposed, like Ben Weigartner, who's been covering a lot of this at Real Clear Investigations, Molly Hemingway from The Federalist, Jonathan Turley, they were there and talking about their experiences and seeing how these NGOs operate in this kind of umbrella of censorship.
So the NGO industrial complex, and how are they censoring people?
Well, how they're involved with sort of flagging disfavored points of view for governments. Many of this now has moved its way across the Atlantic in Europe in a much more meaningful way. So the digital tax that they have there now, the new digital law where Facebook and all these companies are going to be fined if they don't take down misinformation
digital security there.
Right, the digital security law. So there's a lot of this happening in Europe, which I think was part of the point why J.D. Vance gave that speech there in Munich. But they're also involved with a lot of these organizations. Then the Global Disinformation Index or the Global Index, a lot of these fact-checking organizations that were all working in concert again to claim something was right-wing extremism, or how you would sort of shed light on something that they didn't believe in and calling it extreme or alt or whatever it was, right? And then working with other companies that would then boycott, right? So it's a big network of organizations. Mike Benz has talked a lot about this too. Anyway, a lot of this stuff is out there. We highlighted in that committee hearing. But the point is that I think for America, and I'm a United States Senator in this country representing Missouri, that I think we got to get back to this. And the reason why I think America First resonated with the American people is that people do believe in this country, right? They believe in these things like free speech. They believe that our borders matter. They believe that, the good paying jobs that were once here have left and went to China because a lot of people sold them out. So it's been good for some people, but for the vast majority of the population in this country, this kind of globalist view hasn't worked out for him. And I think President Trump is speaking to that in a meaningful way. I think that's why he won. And it's, I think, a lot of the reason we're talking about this, some of the stuff we're talking about today.
Yeah. Well, on that note, Senator, thank you so much for taking the time to speak with me. Fascinating. It's so amazing being in your country and being in DC and what feels like a very revolutionary time. And where can listeners, viewers find you, and what should they be looking out for?
So I think I'm pretty active on X. So at Eric_Schmitt, SCHMITT. And then we're on all the socials on Instagram, Facebook, and try to communicate directly. I think this diffused medium now that we have out there, or the way people get information, like your podcast and others, I love this kind of stuff.
Yeah.
Because I think the fuller form or the longer form content, you can have a degree of depth to conversations that don't fit into a 1 minute soundbite. So I try to do as much of this stuff as I can, but very active on social media and I think trying to fight the good fight. Again, I think the age that we're in right now, or at least the election cycle, was the disruptors versus the establishment. So it's going to be a lot of interesting stuff happening over the next few years.
Yeah. Senator Eric Schmitt, thank you so much for your time.
Good to be with you.
Thanks for watching the Winston Marshall Show with Senator Eric Schmitt. If you want to support the show, remember all you have to do is press subscribe. And if you go over to winstonmarshall.co.uk, you'll get exclusive videos, contents, and interviews. But until next time, be well.